The kitchen clock read 6:47 p.m. when Robert Chin began setting the table for dinner. His movements were practiced, automatic, 4 plates instead of 3, 4 sets of silverware arranged with mathematical precision, 4 glasses filled with ice water. His hands trembled slightly as he placed the 4th setting at the head of the table, in the chair that faced the window overlooking the backyard, where a basketball hoop stood silent and unused. Margaret watched from the doorway, her heart splintering in the familiar way it had every evening for the past 3 years, 2 months and 16 days. She said nothing. She never did. Not when Robert carefully folded the napkin and placed it beside the empty plate. Not when he adjusted the chair, pulling it out slightly as if someone might sit there at any moment. Not when his eyes lingered on that space with a desperate hope that broke her a little more each time. They ate in near silence, the scrape of forks against plates filling the spaces where laughter used to live. Robert occasionally glanced at the empty seat, his jaw working as though he were chewing words he couldn't quite swallow. Margaret studied her hands, her food, the painting on the wall, anywhere but that chair, that place setting, that monument to their shared grief that neither could speak of. After dinner, Robert retreated to his study, while Margaret cleared the dishes. She stacked the 3 used plates in the sink, running hot water over them until steam clouded her vision, or perhaps those were tears. She could never quite tell anymore. Then, with movements as ritualized as her husband's, she reached for the 4th plate. The untouched plate. The one that held no food but carried the weight of everything they'd lost. She washed it carefully, dried it, and returned it to the cabinet. The silverware followed, each piece cleaned and put away. The glass. The napkin refolded and placed in the linen drawer. And finally, she pushed the chair back to its place flush against the table, erasing the evidence of the empty space Robert created every evening. In his study, Robert heard the quiet clinks of dishes being put away. He knew what Margaret was doing. He always knew. Some nights, he wanted to storm into the kitchen and demand she stop, to insist that their son's place remain set, that Michael's absence be acknowledged and honored. Other nights, he wanted to thank her for her mercy, for sparing him the sight of that empty chair through the long, dark hours before morning. Tonight, he simply pressed his forehead against his desk and tried not to remember the last dinner they'd shared as a complete family. Tried not to hear Michael's laugh, bright and clear as bells, announcing he'd enlisted in the Marines. Tried not to see Margaret's face drain of color, or hear his own voice, too harsh, too quick, saying, "If that's what you want, son. If that's what you want." Not, "I'm proud of you," or "I'm scared for you," or "I love you more than my own life." Just that passive, distant phrase that suggested Michael was ordering a pizza instead of volunteering to place himself in harm's way halfway across the world. Robert opened his desk drawer and pulled out a worn photograph. Michael in his dress blues, 19 years old, his whole future ahead of him. In the picture, he was smiling that crooked smile that had melted Margaret's heart from the moment he was born. Robert traced his son's face with one finger, the glass cool and smooth under his touch. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the photograph, as he did every night. "I'm so sorry I didn't say what I meant. I'm sorry I didn't tell you I was terrified. I'm sorry I was angry because I was scared. I'm sorry I let you leave thinking I didn't understand." The photograph, as always, offered no absolution. Upstairs, Margaret sat on the edge of Michael's bed, the one she'd stopped Robert from dismantling a dozen times, the one with sheets she still washed every month though no one slept there. The room remained exactly as Michael had left it, posters of basketball players on the walls, trophies crowding the shelves, a pair of sneakers kicked off carelessly near the closet. She'd even stopped dusting after a while, unable to bear erasing what might be the last traces of her son's physical presence in this house. She picked up the stuffed dog Michael had slept with until he was 8, when he'd suddenly declared himself too old for such things and relegated Mr. Pickles to his desk. Margaret held the toy against her chest and allowed herself to cry, quietly, carefully, so Robert wouldn't hear. She'd become an expert at silent grief, at swallowing sobs until they dissolved like bitter pills in her throat. They'd gotten the call on a Tuesday afternoon. Margaret remembered because she'd been planning to make pot roast for dinner, Michael's favorite, even though Michael was 7,000 miles away in Afghanistan. She'd thought maybe the smell would make her feel closer to him somehow. Instead, the doorbell had rung, and she'd seen two Marines standing on her porch in their dress uniforms, their faces carefully composed into expressions of practiced sympathy. The casualty assistance officer's words had blurred together. Improvised explosive device, killed instantly, no suffering, so sorry for your loss, died a hero, grateful nation. Margaret had nodded and nodded, her head moving up and down like a bobblehead while something inside her shattered so completely she couldn't identify all the pieces. Couldn't even begin to understand what she'd lost until hours later when she'd gone to call Michael to tell him about dinner and remembered she would never call him again. Robert had been at work. He'd come home to find Margaret sitting on the kitchen floor, still holding the phone, unable to speak or move or do anything but exist in the first moments of a grief so vast it had its own gravity. He'd held her, and they'd cried together, and for a brief moment their shared agony had unified them. But grief, Margaret had learned, was not a bridge. It was a chasm, and she and Robert had fallen to opposite sides. The funeral had been everything a military funeral should be: honorable, dignified, precise. The flag folding, the 21-gun salute, the playing of taps that had driven knives into Margaret's heart with each mournful note. Michael's Marine brothers had stood in formation, their faces stoic, their pain visible only in the tightness around their eyes. Friends from high school had wept openly. Neighbors brought casseroles and condolences in equal measure. And through it all, Robert had stood like a statue, his hand gripping Margaret's so tightly she'd lost feeling in her fingers, his face carved from stone. He hadn't cried. Not at the funeral, not at the reception afterward, not when they'd come home to a house that was somehow both exactly the same and completely different because Michael would never walk through the door again. Margaret had shattered. Robert had fossilized. And the distance between breaking and hardening was wider than either of them knew how to cross. The empty seat had appeared that first night after the funeral. Margaret had made dinner mechanically, her body going through motions while her mind remained somewhere else entirely. She'd set 3 places. Robert had stared at the table for a long moment, then quietly retrieved a 4th plate, 4th silverware, 4th glass. He'd set Michael's place as he always had when their son was deployed, a ritual, a superstition, a way of saying you have a place here, you belong here, come home. Except Michael couldn't come home. Michael was in the ground at Arlington National Cemetery, his name carved into white marble that would outlast them all. Margaret had wanted to scream at Robert to stop, that Michael was gone, that setting his place wouldn't bring him back. But the words had lodged in her throat, because she'd understood what Robert couldn't say, that removing Michael's place meant admitting he was gone, and Robert wasn't ready. Might never be ready. So she'd said nothing. And that night, after Robert had fallen into troubled sleep, she'd crept downstairs and put away Michael's unused dishes. If Robert wanted to set the table each evening, she couldn't stop him. But she also couldn't leave it set overnight, couldn't wake each morning to that empty chair mocking her loss. Thus began their silent ritual, their wordless dance of grief. Robert set the place. Margaret cleared it away. Neither spoke of it. Neither acknowledged what they were doing or why. The empty seat became the thing they couldn't discuss, the wound they couldn't name, the evidence that they were breaking in opposite directions. 3 years, 2 months, and 17 days after Michael's death, Robert set the table as always. Margaret watched as always. They ate in silence as always. But that night, something changed. Margaret cleared the dishes as usual, but when she reached for the empty plate, her hands stilled. She stood frozen, the dish halfway to the sink, and suddenly couldn't remember why she'd been doing this. What was she protecting Robert from? What was she protecting herself from? And how had protecting become the same as hiding, become the same as denying? She set the plate back down on the table. Upstairs, she found Robert sitting on Michael's bed, the first time in 3 years he'd entered their son's room. He held the stuffed dog, Mr. Pickles, and tears streamed silently down his face. "I can't do this anymore," he said without looking at her. His voice was raw, scraped hollow. I can't keep pretending he's going to walk through that door. I can't keep setting his place like he's just late for dinner. I can't keep. His voice broke entirely. Margaret sat beside him, the mattress dipping under her weight, and for the first time in 3 years, 2 months and 17 days, she touched her husband with intention. She took his hand. I know, she whispered. I know. I never told him I was proud, Robert continued, the words tumbling out now like water through a broken dam. I never told him that I was angry because I was terrified, that I couldn't stand the thought of him in danger. I just said, if that's what you want, like it didn't matter, like he didn't matter more than anything in the world. He knew, Margaret said, though she wasn't certain. He knew you loved him. Did he? Robert's eyes were wild with pain. Did he know? Or did he die thinking I didn't care, that I was disappointed in his choice, that he couldn't finish? Margaret's own tears fell freely now. I hope he knew. I pray every day that he knew. They sat in silence, hands clasped, surrounded by the remnants of their son's truncated life. The posters and trophies and abandoned sneakers, all the artifacts of a young man who'd never have the chance to become the man he might have been. Why do you put his dishes away every night? Robert asked finally. Margaret considered lying, offering a gentle explanation. But they'd spent too long in gentle lies, in careful silences, in protecting each other from the truth of their grief. Because I can't bear to see them in the morning. Because every day I have to remember he's gone, and seeing that empty place when I come down for breakfast makes it fresh all over again. Because I'm not strong enough to live with that reminder every moment of every day. And I'm not strong enough to erase it, Robert admitted. Setting his place is the only thing that makes me feel like I'm still his father. Like I still have a son. Even though I know it's crazy, even though I know he's gone, I can't stop. If I stop, what am I? Who am I? You're his father, Margaret said firmly. You will always be his father. Nothing can change that. Not death, not time, not anything. Then why does it feel like I'm losing him more every day? Robert's voice cracked. Why does it feel like if I don't keep his place set, if I let go even a little bit, he'll disappear completely? Margaret didn't have an answer. She had only her own questions, her own desperate attempts to hold on to a child who existed now only in memory and photograph. They sat together until the house grew dark around them, until the shadows pooled in the corners of Michael's room like tangible grief. And then, together, they went downstairs. The empty plate still sat on the table where Margaret had left it. Robert stood looking at it for a long time. Then, carefully, he picked it up and carried it to the sink. He washed it himself, dried it, and placed it in the cabinet. He put away the silverware, the glass. He folded the napkin and returned it to the drawer. Margaret stood beside him, her hand on his back, feeling him shake with silent sobs as he completed the ritual he'd never allowed himself before. When everything was put away, when the table was truly cleared, Robert turned to his wife and held her as they both wept for their son, for themselves, for the life they'd imagined that would never be. I don't know how to live in a world without him, Robert admitted into Margaret's hair. Neither do I, she said. But I think we have to learn. Together. The next evening, Robert set 3 places for dinner. His hands shook as he did it, and twice he started to reach for the 4th plate before stopping himself. Margaret stood beside him, her hand on his shoulder, anchoring him as he learned this new ritual of acknowledgement rather than denial. They ate dinner, and the empty space where Michael's chair had been seemed both more and less painful than the empty place setting had been. More painful because it acknowledged the finality of his absence. Less painful because it was truth instead of pretense. After dinner, they cleared the table together. Then Robert did something he hadn't done in 3 years. He asked Margaret to take a walk with him. They wandered through their neighborhood as evening settled into night, past houses lit with the warm glow of families at dinner, families intact and whole. Past the park where they'd taught Michael to ride a bike, where he'd learned to shoot baskets, where he'd kissed his first girlfriend under the oak tree. Tell me your favorite memory of him, Robert said as they walked. Margaret thought for a moment. His 8th birthday. Remember? He wanted a dinosaur cake, but the bakery made it look like a dog somehow. And instead of being disappointed, he was delighted. He named the cake Bernard and made us all say goodbye to Bernard before we could eat any cake. Robert laughed, the sound rusty but real. He was so strange. So wonderfully strange. He paused. My favorite was when he was 5 and declared he was going to be a superhero when he grew up. Not play a superhero or dress up as 1v1. And he was so serious about it. He spent months trying to develop powers. He tried to fly off the garage roof, Margaret remembered, horror and affection mingling in her voice. Gave us both heart attacks, Robert agreed. But he was fearless. He was always fearless. They walked on, trading memories like precious stones, polishing them with words until they gleamed. Michael at 3, covered in spaghetti sauce. Michael at 10, losing his first basketball game and crying not because he lost, but because he'd let his team down. Michael at 16, so proud of his first real job. Michael at 18, holding his acceptance letter to college, torn between excitement and uncertainty. Michael. Their son in all his messy, beautiful, complicated reality. I've been so afraid, Robert said as they circled back toward home, that if I let go of the grief, I'm letting go of him. That if I stop hurting this much, it means he didn't matter enough. I know, Margaret said. I've been afraid of the same thing. But tonight, talking about him, remembering him as he really was, not just the Marine, not just the casualty, but the weird, wonderful boy who tried to fly and named his birthday cake, I felt closer to him than I have since he died. Margaret nodded, understanding perfectly. We've been so focused on how he died that we forgot to remember how he lived. They reached their house and stood in the driveway, looking at the home they'd made, the place where they'd raised their son, where they'd have to learn now to live without him. I want to tell you about him every day, Robert said. I want us to remember him together. Not the perfect memory or the perfect son, but Michael, all of him. The good and the annoying and the funny and the difficult. All of it. Yes, Margaret agreed. Yes, I want that too. They went inside, and for the first time in 3 years, 2 months and 18 days, they sat together in the living room and just talked. About Michael, about themselves, about the marriage they'd almost lost to grief, about the future they'd have to build in the crater their son's death had left. It wasn't healing. Not yet. Healing would take time, maybe years, maybe forever. But it was a beginning. A small step toward learning to carry their grief together instead of alone. Toward honoring Michael's memory not with empty rituals, but with living remembrance. Weeks passed. The empty seat remained absent from the dinner table, but Michael's presence grew stronger in other ways. Robert framed some of Michael's childhood drawings and hung them in the hallway. Margaret finally opened the boxes of his belongings that the Marines had sent home, sorting through letters and photographs, laughing and crying as she rediscovered pieces of her son. They started a tradition of Michael Mondays, one evening a week dedicated to sharing stories about their son, sometimes with friends or family, sometimes just the two of them. The stories ranged from hilarious to heartbreaking, from proud moments to embarrassing ones. They talked about his flaws as well as his virtues, remembering him as a real person instead of an idealized memory. Robert wrote letters to Michael, long letters detailing everything he wished he'd said before his son deployed. He didn't mail them, of course. There was nowhere to send them. But writing them helped him process the regret that had been eating him alive. He told Margaret about the letters, and she started writing her own. They joined a support group for parents who'd lost children in military service. At first, Robert resisted. He didn't want to share his grief with strangers, didn't want to hear other people's pain when his own was so consuming. But Margaret convinced him to try, just once. In that room full of parents who understood exactly what they were feeling, Robert finally found the strength to forgive himself. Not completely, perhaps never completely, but enough to begin moving forward. My son's name was Jeremy, one father said during a meeting. And I've realized that the greatest dishonor I can do to his memory is to stop living my own life. He died so others could live free. If I trap myself in grief, if I make my life a monument to death instead of a celebration of his life, then what was it all for? The words struck Robert like lightning. Michael had chosen to serve, knowing the risks. He'd chosen to put himself in danger to protect others. And Robert had been so consumed by his own pain that he'd forgotten to honor that choice, to respect the bravery and selflessness that had motivated his son. That night, he told Margaret, "I want to volunteer. At the VA hospital or with veteran organizations. I want to do something that matters, something that would make Michael proud." Margaret smiled through tears. He'd like that. He'd like that very much. She began volunteering at a local youth center, working with teenagers who reminded her of Michael, full of potential and confusion, bravery and fear, hope and uncertainty. She couldn't bring her son back, but she could honor his memory by investing in young people who still had their whole futures ahead of them. Slowly, painfully, Robert and Margaret built a new life. Not the life they'd planned, not the life they'd wanted, but a life nonetheless. A life that included Michael even in his absence. A life that honored him by living fully rather than by standing still. On the 4th anniversary of Michael's death, they visited his grave at Arlington. They brought flowers, as always, but this time they also brought a photo album filled with pictures from throughout his life. They sat by his headstone and went through it together, telling stories to each other and to him, laughing at the silly photos and weeping at the meaningful ones. "We miss you every single day," Margaret said to the grave. "Every single moment. But we're learning to live with that missing. We're learning to be happy again, even though you're not here. I hope that's okay. I hope you'd want that for us." Robert placed his hand on the marble headstone, warm from the sun. "I'm proud of you, son. I should have said it more when you were alive. I should have told you every day. But I'm saying it now. I'm so proud of the man you became, the choices you made, the life you lived. It wasn't long enough, but it was bright. God, it was bright." They stayed until the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that Michael had always loved. As they walked back to their car, Margaret slipped her hand into Robert's. "Do you think we're going to be okay?" she asked. Robert considered the question honestly. "I think we're going to be different," he said finally. "We'll never be who we were before. But yes, I think we're going to be okay." That evening, back at home, Robert set the table for dinner. 3 plates. 3 sets of silverware. 3 glasses. Margaret helped him, and they prepared the meal together, moving around each other in the kitchen with a practiced ease they'd almost forgotten. As they sat down to eat, Margaret raised her glass. "To Michael," she said. "To Michael," Robert echoed. "The best son we could have asked for. The best son we'll never stop missing. The best son who taught us, even in his death, how to find our way back to each other." They ate dinner, and the empty chair remained empty. But it no longer felt like an accusation or a wound. It felt like space, space for memories, space for stories, space for the love that death couldn't diminish. Later that night, as they prepared for bed, Robert paused at the door to Michael's room. The door they'd both been opening more often lately, the room they'd slowly been transforming from a shrine into a remembrance, still honoring who Michael had been, but no longer frozen in time. "Do you think he knows?" Robert asked Margaret. "Do you think somehow, wherever he is, he knows that we're trying?" Margaret came to stand beside him, looking into the room that held so many memories. "I hope so," she said. "I really hope so." They turned off the light and closed the door gently. Not erasing, not forgetting, but making space for tomorrow while honoring yesterday. The empty seat was gone, but Michael remained in their hearts, in their memories, in every story they told, and every laugh they shared, and every moment they chose to live fully in honor of the son who couldn't. It wasn't the ending they'd wanted, but it was the one they had, and they were learning, slowly and painfully, to make it enough. In the darkness of their bedroom, Robert reached for Margaret's hand and found it already reaching for his. They fell asleep that way, fingers intertwined, 2 people bound together by love and loss, grief and grace, the past they couldn't change, and the future they'd face together. And somewhere, in the space where memory meets hope, Michael smiled.